I think we will get going. It is a propitious moment. Welcome all to the January Chart Web Interpretation Class for the Galactic and Cosmic Patreon members. Welcome all, welcome. There's a skill and a technique that basically allows us to find the essence of the chart. And these are all charts that I have not looked at before. They're charts that as they come up, each one at a time, it will be it will be obvious some of the things that will speak to us. Now, in a real chart reading, there's obviously more methodical ways to dig in to make sure that we get to all the issues that are important. But often there are things that stand out that become important. Sometimes those things are a natal signature. Sometimes those things are something in the chart that's being stirred by a transit right now. And so in being able to look at those and identify those, it gets us to a point where we gain more confidence in our ability to look at a chart and to figure out, to discern what's important. Next month, we will shift gears and we will take one or two charts and we will dig in deeper and kind of go more into what we might do if we were doing a full reading, and those things which are now, for at least today, being set aside. I'm going to begin by taking a very quick look at a chart of Mary Oliver. Many of you probably know Mary Oliver, the poet who passed away just a couple days ago. Okay, so Mary Oliver was a brilliant poet. She wrote Wild Geese, The Swan, many other poems. And I'm only mentioning this in passing because I want to point out something here that I find is very significant. We do not have an accurate time for Mary Oliver. This is run for 8 a.m., but we don't know her time. If I were looking at her chart, we can get a lot out of a chart without knowing the time. But one of the things that we might do is we might take off aspects to the moon so that that we don't get misled, because we know in this chart is for 8 a.m. So we know that the chart is in Aquarius. The moon is in Aquarius, so that there's going to be that conceptual, intellectual, emotional detachment, if you will, because the moon moves about 12 degrees a day, and so we know that the moon won't be prior to about 10 degrees or after about 22 degrees of Aquarius, but we don't know its aspect. I want to point out two things, just quickly passing through this chart, just because Mary Oliver is such a potent and powerful poet. The closest aspect in her chart is Mars in Scorpio. She has Jupiter and Mars in Scorpio. This is the transformation. This is with Jupiter and Mars together, the optimism about turning the dark into light, which Mary Oliver certainly had a knack of doing. But look how close the Mars is, its partile within a degree, trine to Pluto, and that's getting right to the core of the matter. This is someone who can go deep and go beyond deep. And of course, Mars and Jupiter in Scorpio. Mars is at home. It's in ancient astrology, Mars ruled Scorpio. In modern astrology, we associate Pluto with Scorpio, and the two of them are trine one another. But for a writer, look at this conjunction right here of a tight conjunction, like within 3 degrees of Venus, Neptune, and the Sun. In Virgo, the sign of exact writing, and although we don't have this aspect marked here, it's square Chiron. There's something about the healing involved in the romantic visionary, and I use romantic, not, hey, welcome, Alexis, Thanks, Gail, for helping Alexis get that straightened out. Appreciate it. Um, that Venus and Neptune so close together is often about romance, but it's really about the romantic, which may or may not be about romantic love. Because if you think of the romantic writers and artists, the romantic period, it's really about the fantasy and what goes on in the brain. You read romantic poets like Byron, for example, and you can read 30 or 40 pages of words and nothing happens because it's all fantasy. And with Mary Oliver, the ability to take that the love of what is beautiful and turn it into fantasy and do it in a way that's connected with Mother Earth, with nature, is extremely, extremely important. But before I jump off this chart, I want to switch the aspect set. And so I'm showing you now a chart with the quintiles. And quintiles are based upon a 5-pointed star. And what we have in Mary Oliver's chart is a signature that again and again and again I see in the chart of artists and writers and spiritual leaders and just creatives in general. And it's like a yod, but instead of having a sextile at the base and a quincunx and a quincunx, these are 3 points on a 5-pointed star. So it's a much higher order of perfection or geometry. If you had a 5-pointed star, there would be another point here somewhere in Taurus, and then there would be another point here somewhere in early Sagittarius. But Mercury, and we don't know her ascendant because we don't really have a time of day, but Mercury, Pluto, and Saturn are tied up in a quintile yod or a golden yod. This is based on the golden mean, the divine proportion. I'll do a class down the road in a couple of months on interpreting quintiles. It's something that many modern astrologers pass by, but it's incredibly important. And it shows how important here in Mary Oliver's chart, because it's Mercury who was sent to Mercury, sent into Pluto, the underworld, to work out a deal with Hades to rescue Persephone. And it's that talking about the hidden aspects of things in a creative manner, but doing it through this structured Saturn belief, Saturn in Pisces, the belief in the solidity and the stability of the mystical. And I think that Mary Oliver certainly wore that. There's a lot more we could say about her chart. I just wanted in passing to pay respects to, I think, one of the finest modern American poets. And so even though she's passed on, her work shall live on. Okay, now let's go back to the regular aspect sets, or what I use here is the Ptolemaic aspects. And let's go back and add in the moon, and then we will start off with Rachel. You are first on the list. Rachel, if you are here, raise your hand, and Gail can get you set up on microphone and camera. And
raise my hand.
I hear.
How do I raise my hand?
I think you already did somehow.
Okay.
Hold on.
Okay.
And there we go.
There we go.
And all right, let's get you up here on video somewhere. Your camera is pointing at the ceiling. So
At the ceiling.
oh, there you are. All right.
Okay.
That's because it looks like you're laying down and pointing at the ceiling too.
Right. Okay. There we go.
All right. I want that
Can't see
recliner.
myself.
I want that recliner chair. It looks comfortable.
Yeah, it's pretty comfortable.
Okay. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
All right. So we're setting the clock. We got about 5 or 7 minutes to take a look here. It's 2:27, and away we go. Do you know your chart? I mean, have you spent some time with the chart?
Sure. Yeah.
and you're comfortable with that's 29-degree Sagittarius rising rather than Capricorn rising, or do
Yes.
you wonder about that sometimes?
No, I've had my chart rectified, so that seems to be the accurate time.
Gotcha. The reason I ask is that whenever I look at a chart with an ascendant or especially ascendant or moon, because they're the fastest moving things, so close to the beginning or ending of a sign, it's something always worth questioning and always worth looking at. Obviously, your chart just, 2 minutes of clock time later would have been 0 degrees of Capricorn rising. And it's tough, though, to know for sure because your two planets in Sagittarius are buried in the 12th house anyhow. And so, it's hard to really discern sometimes the difference. Even when someone rectifies a chart, I still have my doubts because the lines up there aren't as precise as we would like to think they are. Now, having said that, there is a precise division in your chart, though, because your moon at 28, almost 29 degrees of Leo is definitely, assuredly not in Virgo. And so that becomes significant, and it becomes significant because the moon in your chart is conjunct 5 degrees off, but conjunct Pluto, 5-degree orb. And that becomes an important key piece. And even without your sun in Scorpio, the Moon Pluto conjunction would kind of make you an honorary Scorpion anyhow, because there's the sense of that intensity and the power and the passion with which you respond. It's significant, I think, also, as I'm taking first look at your chart, that your sun is square the nodes. And in fact, the moon and Pluto are in the same sign as the south node. And so there's almost something like the blessing of your Sagittarius rising is the ability to not be quite as stuck in those things that you know to be true. Look, your chart has a lot of rigidity. It has a lot of fixed energy in it. Even the Jupiter opposition to the sun, which is certainly open and expansive. And even if you had Capricorn rising, and I'm not saying you do, but even if you did, it would be hard to know that you did, because the Jupiter opposition to the sun is another flavor of Sagittarius. So I guess what I'm saying is the stuff comes through one way or another. It leaks through regardless of how we rectify or re-rectify a chart. But the sun opposition Jupiter from Scorpio to Taurus is an interesting opposition, because Jupiter is expansive and is opening and does bring opportunities, but that Jupiter is in Taurus. It's a fixed sign. Your sun is in Scorpio, fixed sign. Your nodal axis is in a fixed axis, Leo, Aquarius, and your moon Pluto together are conjunct in Leo, another fixed sign, which certainly suggests the need in your life in general to work at being open, to work at opening yourself to potentials and possibilities. Now, you have an amazing ally. You actually have a few allies in doing that. The most obvious one is the fact that Uranus is closely trine your sun, which says regardless of how much rigidity and fixity and obstinacy and self-determination you may have, things happen and you're okay with it. When you adapt and you adjust when you have to, very quickly. And if you feel like you're going to get something positive out of it, well, you also actually can respond in a way that is enabling you to change with the tides, and actually, for that matter, even change the tide itself. All right, so that Uranus trine the sun, I think, is a real blessing for you, because it enables you not only to respond to change, but I think it enables you to make change when you feel like you're being stuck. The other piece of this is, and we sometimes forget, we think of Capricorn as being Saturn related, and it is. But Capricorn is a cardinal sign. It is about initiating a new experience. And your Mars, which is the ancient ruler, the traditional ruler of Scorpio, your Mars is in Capricorn. And today, for you, Rachel, this eclipse is representing what Johannes Kepler called a transit return, meaning it's not a Saturn return, it's not a Mars return. In fact, Saturn and Mars are not in the same places that they were in your birth chart, even by sign. But the relationship between Mars and Saturn in the sky right now is the same relationship as it is when you were born. Robert Blaschke wrote a book on this Kepler idea. He called it holographic transits. And it's the idea is that when a pattern in your birth chart, like your Mars square Saturn, is replicated by the transiting planets right now at the eclipse, Mars is squaring Saturn, it's almost like it's almost like the cosmos is playing your song. I mean, Mars square Uranus is arguably one of the most frustrating aspects possible, unless you learn to manage it, in which case it can be one of the most productive aspects possible. And the reason is, and I've probably said this in different ways here before, is that Mars is the gas and Saturn is the brake, and they kind of want to work in conflict with one another. But when you can get that sense of learning how to control the two in tandem, you can actually not have to slam on the brake because you've gone too hard, or push on the accelerator because you're all of a sudden, there's a car coming up your butt, so to speak, and you got to get out of the way. It's instead you can kind of work the two of them together. And yet right now this eclipse has a little bit of your stuff going on with it. I would say here that this T-square with Mars, Uranus, and squaring Saturn in your chart is certainly a bit of that dilemma of having a high level of determination, rigidity, and kind of even stubbornness. But at the same time, it's like when you have your hands on the controls, you can do crazy stuff that you don't like it when other people do it. But it's like it's your way of kind of counteracting that overstability. The fact is that your chart has a lot of structure and stability and rigidity, but it also has the grease, the movement, not only of the Uranus trine the sun, which is a love of change. And here you are, a fixed person, but you really do know that when things change, it usually works out for the better. And so there's a part of you that is attracted to how confusing things get at that moment of change, because that's when you go to town. That's when you can kind of make it work. Even the intensity and power and rigidity of the Pluto Moon conjunction, which creates and is attracted to its own level of drama because of the intensity, even that is sextiling the Saturn-Neptune, which we didn't talk about a whole lot, nor are we going to, because we're already past the time that we wanted to be at. But this is, again, Saturn makes it real and Neptune makes it imaginary. And so, again, we see the dilemmas in your chart of being pulled in both ways, and how a lot of your being is about managing that dance between the extremes, whatever those extremes may be at any point in time, whether it's the Jupiter opposing the sun, whether it's the Mars opposing the Uranus. There's a sense of when you do, you tend to overdo, and therein comes in the Mars not only square to Saturn and Neptune. It's easy for you to decipher what happened after the fact sometimes. But when you're in the middle of it, sometimes the most immediate way for you to deal with with a difficult situation is to just blow the whole thing up. And I don't mean that physically, but in some way stir it up, because what's important will settle out and settle out right. It usually does, or maybe it always does. The last thing I would say before we moved on here is, from a timing standpoint, we obviously have Saturn over the last several years, going back 5 years ago or so. Saturn lined up with your sun, so what was going on back then certainly has set the stage for what was going on about a year ago, when actually more like 13, 14 months ago, when Saturn lined up with your Venus and then your ascendant, maybe created some sort of change with respect to money, love, home, all of that stuff when Saturn came over your ascendant last holiday season. I don't mean the most recent one, I mean a year plus ago. And then Saturn moved into Capricorn, and it is now still kind of back and forth over your Chiron. But the real issue in your chart is that Pluto is already there and Saturn is pushing on it. If we were to put Saturn where it will be when it joins up with Pluto next January, it's basically at 22 degrees, 21, 22 degrees of Capricorn. And so if you were my client, I certainly would want to look at what was going on during your most recent Saturn return, when Saturn was in Libra, and then prior to that, and take that 7 years back to when Saturn was back in Cancer, and then 7 years prior to that, when Saturn back in the mid-90s was in Aries, and then prior to that, 7 years back, when one Saturn cycle ago, probably like 1991, 90, 91, right in there, when Saturn was back in Capricorn, and take that Saturn all the way back through its conjunctions and squares and oppositions to your natal Saturn, Neptune, Mars, and Uranus. And by playing that backward, kind of projecting forward in a year, what it will be like if you do nothing, if you just fall into the course of least resistance that you may have before, and what would it mean if you started applying some pressure and some work and some discipline now, today, tomorrow, the next day, so that in a year you don't find yourself in a crisis. Instead, you find yourself actually getting the payback from the work that you did over the year. Your turn.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to the Saturn Pluto.
Well, you need to change that.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious. I mean, I have 6 planets in mid-cardinal in my chart, and I have to work on reframing that, because what we resist will persist, what we fear will appear. Where's the rhyming coming from? But rather than worrying, rather than spending the year in worry about what could happen because of what happened in the past, instead, it's you have the power. And you have the power to either build a dam on the river and divert some of the river this way or that way. You have the power to, I mean, the water is going to find its level at the sea no matter what we do. The question is, what can you do along the way to make the most of this, rather than having this, make the most of you.
Okay.
You with me?
Oh, yeah. And, and really with Pluto on my Mars right now, it's not bad. I mean, I don't know. It's not.
Pluto on Mars is only bad if you're repressing or suppressing the Martian energy, and or if you're not used to working with the intensity of the Martian energy. In your chart, because your Mars is natally square, Saturn, you're used to that rhythm of suppress, express.
Right.
Repress, become aware of, express. Suppress, express. repress, become aware of, express. That rhythm to you is part of your life. You know, at the same time, you are a Scorpio. So when Pluto comes to your Mars, Mars is exalted in Capricorn. It loves being there. And so this is not a time to go, you know, into a corner and think about all the people who are out to get you. This is a time to use that energy in a constructive way that's for the good of all. Pluto doesn't like it when you try to corner its energy and become greedy and do good things for yourself only. But if you can work with that energy and express it, man, this is a powerful and creative time.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
good luck, and
Okay.
at the risk of being you know, too Arianly, what's the right word? Ariesly abrupt, we're going on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Rachel. Anne, you are next. And okay, let's in another 29 degrees rising. Are you here, Anne?
Yes,
Oh, I hear you. I don't see you.
I'm here. Oh, but now, wait a minute.
There you are.
There I am.
There you are. Hey,
Hey.
nice to see you. Okay, so I don't know how reality does these. I just take these in order, the order that they appear in, and we have a second 29-degree rising, Gemini rising versus Cancer rising. You know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, again, 3 or 4 minutes later, you would have had Cancer rising, and 99%. I don't know if that percentage is right, of your first house is actually Cancerian, but the rising moment is still that last tickle, that last, you know, whimsical expression of Gemini. And does that, I mean, do you feel Gemini rising versus Cancer rising?
I've always felt more Cancer rising, although there's definitely a Gemini component. How I come off to people, I definitely have two sides, or a professional side, or you know, with my close friend side. I'm a nice person all around, of course, but sometimes people are a little bit surprised, paradoxical things about me that they don't expect, but are genuine.
Well, the paradoxical things about you that I see that stands out is that the predominant aspect, when we look at the color of the aspects in your chart, there's a lot of smooth, you know, kind of easy sextiles, trines, but look at those quincunxes, and those are the pieces of you that are, it's like one side doesn't necessarily match up or fit in with the other side, except they're both different sides. You know, I sometimes think of, you know, that saying, well, that person and I are not on the same page. Well, it's like there are planets in your chart that are not in the same on the same page. They're not even in the same chapter, but they're in your book. And you can't make them go. You can't make them go away, you know. And so on one hand, you know, we have the we have this Earth side of you. That's the Taurus Sun, mid-Taurus Sun, harmonized or trine to a, you know, kind of an almost mid-Capricorn moon. This is pretty. This is like feet in. I was going to say it's feet on the ground. It's not. It's like feet stuck in the ground up to your knees. I mean, this is like stable. This is like, you know, kind of like, you know where you're standing, and you know which direction you're walking in, and however fast or slow you might go, you know when you're going to get there because you know what you're carrying along. This is like absolute, you know, determination. But it's determination, and in a way self-determination. And yet the interesting thing is that Capricorn moon is in the 7th house. And so it's like self-determination, but it's wrapped around someone else. It's self-determination that projects its energy and has what it is it knows that the mountain is out there. You're climbing your mountain, but the mountain is external. And maybe that's what Capricorn is always about for everyone, but for you more so, because that moon in Capricorn is projected. In some ways, it's someone else's stability that creates the mountain that you climb. But here's the strange thing, and that is that moon in Capricorn is quincunx Uranus in Leo, which is also quincunx Mars in Pisces, and that Mars in Pisces is on your midheaven. So and this then becomes a yod, a yod, which is where two planets are sextile. That would be your stable, business-headed Capricorn moon that can take the facts and figures and figure out how to project them into where you're going. It's the Mars on the midheaven, which gives you the physical energy to do it. But it's interesting because, as I've said many times before, Mars in Pisces is the physical energy to do it, but it does it metaphysically because Pisces is spiritual. This is the spiritual warrior. This is the, in some ways, the Mars in Pisces on the midheaven, in some ways, this is the administration, how do I want to say this? This is the high priestess who, rather than does ceremony, is the administrator. that because that Mars is like a spiritual warrior in effect. And yet this part of you where the physical energy and the concrete down to earth Capricorn moon, and even the stable Taurus sun, in some ways that Mars though is also at odds with Uranus. And Uranus in some ways is not a personal planet. It's kind of the deepest well springs of our creative energy, in Leo. Uranus wants to be creative in the way that it puts on the show. It's creative in its way that it manifests, that it does external presentation, so to speak. But again, with that quincunx to Mars, with the quincunx to Moon, it's like, how real do I need to be? How much energy should I apply? And that Uranus in some ways just doesn't fit in. And yet here's the magic of your chart, is that there are so many trines floating around every which way, is even though the Uranus is not playing by the rules or playing in the same book as the Mars midheaven or the projected, stable Uranus in Capricorn. However, you like it because it's harmonized to that Venus in Aries. You like it when things are new and different and exciting. And so the Uranus gets, let's say your Uranus gets what it needs because it does it outside of the stable career. Both the Mars on the midheaven and the Moon in Capricorn are both career related. The Mars in Capricorn by sign, but the Mars on the midheaven because it's the midheaven. And yet that Venus harmonized to Uranus becomes kind of the love of the adrenaline rush from whatever it is that's not as stable as everything else. All right, let's take a quick look at this opposition of Jupiter to Mercury, because our last chart, Rachel, also had Jupiter. Hers was in opposition to the sun. These are both kind of honorary Sagittarius aspects because they enable you to be in relationship. Oppositions are almost always some facet of a relationship, not necessarily the relationship, but relationship in general. And so this in some way is the part of you that, again, it's the Venus and Mercury in Aries. You can make shit up as you go. You're really good at being in the moment and doing things for the first time, if you will. That Mercury can be put on the spot and figure out what it needs to say without having a script. And yet its opposition to Jupiter always is weighing and judging it and saying, what's my place in this versus the place of the relationship, whatever that relationship is. And I would imagine in some ways it goes back to the stabilizing Capricorn moon that becomes an important piece of all this. Look at that Saturn. Saturn, I've never seen such a sweetly aspected Saturn. This is good news and bad news. When I say sweetly aspected, I don't. I mean that there's no squares or oppositions or quincunxes. And this is good news, bad news. You know, traditional astrology would say, wow, your Saturn is trine to Mercury. It's actually part of a very wide grand trine. It doesn't show here because my aspects are set a little bit tight.
I found it, yeah.
But it's Mercury trine, Mercury at 22 degrees, trine Saturn at 24 degrees of fire, trine Pluto at 29 degrees. Look at that Pluto. That Pluto does not want to be the oldest person in the Pluto and Virgo generation. It would much rather be the youngest person in the Pluto and Leo generation. It's already touched into Virgo. You waited for that Pluto to come back. It's like a, hell no, I don't want to go into Virgo. Don't make me go into Virgo. Let me think I'm God or goddess. I mean, I have Pluto in Leo too, and Pluto in Leo generation takes the brunt of now Pluto's in younger generations of Pluto's in Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and even Sagittarius. And they all laugh at us Pluto and Leos for thinking we're gods. And, I remember reading an old book by Ron Davison called Astrology, brilliant little book, red and black cover. If you can find it, buy it. It's one of the better books on astrology ever written. And in the section of his delineation under Pluto and Leo, it said megalomania, which is a classic symptom of schizophrenia. It's the belief that one is God. And I remember reading that, thinking that no self-righteous Pluto and Leo person would not at some point in time in their life think that he or she is God or goddess. It's that idea of the generation, the I, me, mine generation, of actually exploring the gods and goddesses within. Jean Shinoda Bolen, the gods within, the goddesses within, the gods in every man, the goddesses in every woman. But that Pluto is widely trine to Mercury, and that makes a grand fire trine. It's like no matter what happens, you can turn on your closed circuit TV and it has instructions for what you do next to take care of yourself. It's like boom. And that is a very functional part of your chart, especially since that Saturn is also harmonized with Chiron by sextile and Jupiter. That Saturn is incredibly functional. You're the person who's methodical, is the organizer, is the person who can look at a complex task, break it down, figure out what to do, and just do it. And people rely on you for that. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that should I not say the bad news? The bad news is this. Whenever we have a natal planet that's so sweetly aspected with no pressure, no stress, no tension against it, even a tough planet like Saturn. I mean, you are a Capricorn moon. Saturn does your bidding. Saturn does your moon's bidding, and Saturn does it well. Even so, when that Saturn is under pressure, for example, when you have a planet moving through the sky or meet someone or are in relationship with someone with planets, let's say in Pisces, square that Saturn, or in Virgo, square that Saturn, or even in Gemini, opposed that Saturn. When that Saturn of yours gets stressed, either by relationship or by a transiting planet moving through the sky, Neptune over the next few years will eventually reach. It's in mid Pisces right now. Neptune, when it reaches 24 degrees of Pisces, it will be squaring your Saturn. Your Saturn doesn't know how to handle stress that it doesn't manufacture and process. In other words, in other words, your Saturn is really good at what it does, but it's not, you know, it's that thing of like when we face adversity and we survive, you know, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger, Nietzsche. It's like when we overcome adversity, that planet gets stronger. And I'm not saying you've never had any adversity. I'm saying, though, that your Saturn, because it works so well, when it gets messed with, you could probably look back at when transiting Saturn was moving through Virgo, as an example, or just any faster moving planets. Mars recently was moving through, Mars right now in the sky is in Aries, but it was recently moving through Pisces. And you might go back in an ephemeris and check and see the few days when Mars in the sky was actually squaring your Saturn. Right now in the sky at this eclipse, we have Mars square Saturn. And so these are energies that you're not quite as adjusted to or used to. And that's, I think, a good reason why sometimes having a square in our chart helps us make that planet a bit stronger. Last thing I want to mention is as far as timing goes. Right now, you've recently, a year and a half ago, experienced your second Saturn return, when perhaps you reshuffled your life a little bit to kind of stabilize things for what I like to call the third of life, whether or not you make it into the fourth third of life or not. But also then Saturn came up over your descendant, which is a bit of a structural change, often looking back at what was happening when Saturn, about 9 years ago, when Saturn was moving through the beginning of Virgo and you were setting on this career path that you're on now. And now as Saturn is coming up over the horizon, there's a beginning of moving into the world. And actually, in a way, it's almost like getting recognized for what you've been doing already for, 10 years. But it's like that process of continuing the climb up the ladder. And yet in this period of time, that Saturn will conjunct the moon, it actually just has, and then will retrograde back over it, maybe not quite. Let's here quickly put up a bi-wheel that just so that we can see what this looks like. And we're going to, hang on just here 1 second, and then we're going to move on to the next chart because we're going to plow through some, hopefully. Here we go. All right, so now we have your chart in the center without any aspects. Here's where the planets are around the outer side. What I want to do is I want to get rid of displayed transiting points, and I only want to show the outers, and that is perfect there. Let's add Mars, though, and okay, and there. All right, so what I want to show right here is Saturn, and I want to go back. Let's go back a week at a time, and here we go. Right here, when Saturn was coming up over your ascendant, and right there is when Saturn lined up with your moon. So we're still looking at just before Christmas, but coming into Christmas, when Saturn lines up with the moon between, just the week before Christmas leading up to Christmas, this is about not feeling at home at home. This is like kind of the pressure and the stress that a snake feels. I'm not saying you're a snake, but that a snake feels when the skin is too tight and it's outgrown its shell, and we think, oh, how wonderful a snake, when it outgrows its skin, it sheds it and there's new skin. Well, that's great as we look at it from the outside, but from the inside, if the snake inhales too deeply, the fucking skin rips. It hurts. So it's this constriction, this feeling like we've been squeezed into this narrowing tunnel, and then we take a breath and it hurts because the skin rips. Now, granted, what happens is that we then leave that skin behind and we create a new skin, But at first, we feel incredibly vulnerable because we have baby butt skin all over our body. It's raw. And so there's this feeling of vulnerability. And Saturn now is coming past that. But then Saturn turns retrograde, and I don't think it comes quite back that far. I think it reaches, it just comes back to 13 degrees. So in some ways, this process of your Saturn return a year and a half ago to your Saturn going over your moon just the end of last year, and now this year, as we track that Saturn forward, I'm just bringing it back a little bit, and as we track that Saturn forward, we can see that once that Saturn's cleared from your moon, which it is now, you should be breathing better already. But that Saturn is moving closer and closer to trining to your sun. And I think this is the saving grace of 2019 for you. I mean, there are other things going on, and you're certainly getting the buzz of that Mars, kind of being in the sign of your Venus and Mercury right now. So you're probably feeling that a bit. But Saturn trining throughout this year, your sun, it reaches the first trine right around there in mid-February, and then it turns retrograde, and it goes back over that point back in mid-July, and then it turns direct and goes over that point a third and final time by October into November. And so I think more than anything else for you, Anne, this is a year for building the stability and solidity that you've been planning on and thought about, especially because as Jupiter is moving through Sagittarius, it will eventually catch up with your Saturn by the end of the year too, and that'll take those things where there's been contraction and pulling back, and kind of long-term investment, and allow them to begin to bear fruit. How'd we do?
How lovely. Great. Beautiful.
Anything else I need to know?
Well, no, I mean, you mentioned that I did start working for the psychic medium 9 years ago. So that time dried up, and things have sort of evolved a bit, and your timing is right on the nose, right on the money.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's
Great.
leave you in the dust. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and we are going to move on to Lewis. Lewis, are you there?
I am.
Yay.
Yay.
Hi, Lewis. I think we almost lined you up last month, and then I was missing birth data or something. I don't remember. Do you have video? I can hear you.
Yes, I can see.
No, I mean your video camera.
Is it on? Oh, hold on.
Gail may need to turn it on if Gail. Oh,
How's that?
Yay. Hey.
Yay.
Okay. And you're a Lewis, not a Louis.
You can call me Lou, or my friends call me Lou.
Lou. All right. Well,
That's
okay.
good.
We're friends now.
Excellent.
All right. So again, one of the reasons why I have created the chart wheels the way that I do graphically, and for anyone using SolarFire, you can get these exact same wheels. They come with SolarFire. They're under the wheel selection. They're Levine Wheel 1, and you can make the aspects thicker the closer the tighter the orbs are. But one of the reasons why I do that is I love looking at a chart and getting the buzz. To me, I may have said this here before, I love music. I grew up learning music theory. I play a bunch of instruments, none of them well to perform, but I play a lot of music and listen to music. And to me, in music, when you play two notes at once, that's a chord. In geometry, when you make a line inside of a circle, that's a chord. And the two actually have something very much in common. Pythagoras said that everything in the universe it arises in harmony. And whenever we look at two notes in astrology, let's just say the sun and Jupiter. Oh, this is our third chart in a row now where we've had a Jupiter hard aspect, either a square or an opposition. But you can see this red line here connecting the sun and Jupiter, the sun, Mercury, and Jupiter. That red line is a chord, because a chord is any line inside of a circle. But it's also a chord that plays a note that we can hear. And when I look at the aspects in a chart, I can hear whether these notes are resonant, dissonant, annoying, constructive, destructive, and red lines, which are based upon conjunction, squares, and oppositions, are in fact what a physicist would call destructive, but that doesn't mean that they're bad. It means that the two notes on the chord basically have to give up something for the other one that we then respond to by putting energy or attention into it and then turning it into something constructive. And so the first thing that I look at your chart, when I look at your chart, Lou, is I see a couple of symmetries. I see with the red square, an astrologer would call this a grand square. Some astrologers refer to this as a grand cross. That's a newer term, but it's technically a grand square because we have 1, 2, 3, 4 squares working their way around the chart, which means that each point in the square is opposed to another point in the square. Now, squares are unstable. When we build something and we just make a 90-degree angle, it falls apart. We have to put something crosswise to we call a stress to hold the stress to contain the shape. Now, because 90-degree angles are unstable, they demand attention. I look at 90-degree angles in a chart, especially when there's a lot of them. It's almost like they're built-in alarm clocks. There's always something that if we're not paying attention to, it's going to fall apart. And for that reason, people with lots of squares in their chart get really good at attending those things that would fall apart if they weren't paying attention to them. But because they're paying attention to them, then they can build structure. They make stability. They make things happen. They're creative. Squares are creative because if we don't create from the planets, then they can become destructive. So we must take squares and do something with them. Now, in your chart, we look at the points on the square, and we start off and we see, interestingly enough, your squares, although they're relatively tight, the orbs are low, they're tight orbs, they're out of modality. What do I mean by that? Well, when you have two planets trine, in your case, let's say Saturn and Pluto, Saturn in Earth sign Capricorn, Pluto in Earth sign Virgo, they're in the same element. In Anne's chart we just looked at, she had a bunch of trines that were all fire. That was a fire grand trine. So trines live in the same element, but if you have a planet very early in an element, like your Pluto, and let's say that Saturn in your chart was back at 29 degrees and 59 minutes of Sagittarius, it would not be in the same element. It would then be fire to earth, but it would still be trine. And we call that an out of element trine. So it's easier to see with trines because we think elementally. Now with squares are traditionally in the same mode. What are the modes? The modes are cardinal, fixed, and mutable. And so just like we could start here in a natural wheel with Aries and go around and say Aries, fire, Taurus, air, fire, Aries, fire, Taurus, earth, Gemini, air, Cancer, water. We go around in a natural horoscope, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, fire, earth, air, water, fire, earth, air, water, fire, earth, air, water. But at the same token, we also go around with the modalities, with the modes, we go around cardinal, fixed, mutable. Aries is cardinal, Taurus is fixed, Gemini is mutable, cardinal, Cancer is cardinal, Leo is fixed, Virgo is mutable, cardinal, fixed, mutable, cardinal, fixed, mutable. All right, so when we have two planets in square, let's say your Jupiter to Pluto, that's a square. Sagittarius is mutable, Virgo is mutable, and so that's obviously a mutable square. You add in the Mars and the Moon, also at very early degrees of Gemini, that's mutable too. But we come up here to the other point of your grand square, and the mutable point would be 0 Pisces. Well, instead, your Mercury is at -1 degree of Pisces, which puts it, instead of in a mutable sign, it puts it in a fixed sign. And then the sun just a couple degrees behind that. There's no question about it. Your sun is still square that Jupiter. I mean, it's only 3 degrees of orb. It's still opposed Pluto. It's still square Mars. But the fact of the matter is, and the Mercury pulls it even closer, but that Sun Mercury is a bit of an oddity and a holdout. And one of the things that I love about doing a chart is I love about zoning in on what makes this chart different. All too often, we just focus on what makes the chart the same. Lots of people have grand squares. Grand squares are unstable, but they're symmetrical. And so there's a high element of things happening all the time. And yet there's a high element of creativity. And yet in your chart, because your Sun and your Mercury are in air, that the air, oddly enough, harmonizes with the Mars and Moon. They're really square to it, but because they're so close to the end of the sign, and these are so close to the beginning of a sign, that it kind of throws it out of whack a little bit. And I find that the grand squares where one or more points are in another mode are a little bit more difficult to express, a little trickier. But in fact, the movement in your chart is from the rigidity, from the rigidity of knowing. That's what Aquarius is. Aquarius is a fixed air sign. It kind of comes to an awareness by Saturn, because traditionally Uranus is ruled by Saturn. It comes to its awareness, air, its thinking through logic and rationality. But once it gets there, it can break out of the limits. Science is technology that pushes beyond the limits. And then we get the Uranian side of Aquarius, and that's the invention, the innovative, the ingenious, the new. But that in itself has its own form of reorganization of information at a higher level. So Aquarius is the sign of rigidly knowing that which is new that other people may not be aware of yet. It's that ahead of the curve. And yet in your chart, when planets are moving around through the zodiac and they reach the end of a sign, whatever sign it is, if it's the end of Aquarius, they conjunct your Sun and Mercury. But if they're reaching the, let's say, the end of Libra, they're harmonizing or trining with your Sun and Mercury. Whatever it is that they're reaching the end of, they're making an aspect with your air sign, your fixed air, Sun and Mercury. But as soon as they move into the next sign, all of a sudden they lock into place. But they lock into place in a mutable square, and mutable is about change. It's about being adaptable. So in a way, even though you're born at an opening moon square, you were born 7 days after a new moon, this is a crisis and conflict of kind of things happen, and then you have to adapt or change and either leave something aside or adapt to it. But it's almost like your whole being is about coming to a conclusion and then changing it. And that changing it, that being adaptable, is the gift of this grand square, of this ability to use the force of Mars and the ability, the cleverness of Gemini, and the intensity and the depth of Pluto that, I mean, you're a person that when you get an idea and something happens, I imagine that you're no fun to argue with because you can hold a position and you can hold it really well. But in some ways, it's often the position that you're holding is one that you got to from another position that you abandoned, which makes you abandoned, that makes you even a more dangerous opponent in arguing, because often you can see the fallacy of where you're coming from and where you've arrived, which basically allows you to see the weak points in someone else's argument. Now, before I take a paragraph end breath, let's just add to that, to the fact that grand squares can be problematic if there's no way out of them. And your chart has a way out of 2 points on that grand square. Number one, the Pluto point is a trine to Saturn. And in a way, this is the part of you that can actually work in the real world, building hierarchy, creating status, mastering something enough to become, to do something with the energy that you have, although sometimes that doesn't get along with the whole more adaptable emotional side. It does give you, like we talked about in Ann's chart, it gives you a mountain to climb. It gives you something to go with. So that trine off of Pluto is 1 point off of your grand square. The other point off of your grand square is the Neptune off of the moon. And here is a little bit more interesting because you have a traditional yod where you have Jupiter and, let me do that again. You have Saturn and Neptune in sextile one another. So Saturn, the planet of reality, and Neptune, the planet of dreams, in your chart are working well together. This is Caroline Casey's using imagination Neptune to lay down the tracks for the reality train Saturn to follow. So here, the spiritual versus the real, the dreams versus the practical are working together, and yet they're both a bit befuddled by this part of you that is always ready to describe or explain or act on your feeling, even though your feelings are less stable than the actual stability that sits behind them. Your feelings are more whimsical, are more versatile, and yet they don't come without the weight of Pluto behind them. So I find this an intriguing chart. One other aspect that shows up very strong before we move on is the Venus square and a half to Neptune, which again, like the first chart we did, like Mary Oliver's chart, this is the romantic. But for you, it's a sesqui-square, and so there's a bit of you that fights that energy of the romantic. It's like whether it gets you into trouble or there's a piece of that just is not as reliable or stable as some of the things that you would like to build your life on. It doesn't mean that it is non-existent. I know there were two negatives there. Feedback, thoughts, comments, your turn.
Okay. Well, it definitely makes a lot of sense. And the idea of, the expression, I think I'm looking for like the conflict between Saturn, not the conflict, but the way Saturn and Neptune relate to one another. I have 1 foot in the material world and 1 foot very deeply planted in the metaphysical world. I'm a mortgage banker.
Oh, okay.
That's how I make a living. But metaphysical astrology, the whole gamut of abstract thoughts and ideas, it's always been my passion. The mystery schools. So I'm trying to find a way to find my expression in a physical sense, but at the same time having to put bread on the table and take care of my responsibilities. And as you know, from the banking experience, even with the market meltdown from 2008, there have been a series of events that have happened in my life out of the blue that have been rocked my world, but I am adaptable and I find a way to persevere. And I definitely have, I think verbal communication is one of my strong suits, but I am a fixed sign, as you pointed out, and I definitely like a good argument.
And a fixed sign rising too, that Taurus rising.
Yeah, I love a good debate. I love, I have a way of expressing myself, and people think that not that I'm over pushy, but I make a good argument. And when I believe something in my heart, I have no problem finding the words to convey what I'm feeling and expressing myself. So that's probably my strong suit. Romantically, the Venus, Neptune, Venus and Pisces, obviously when I fall hard, but I kind of the standoffish because I haven't had a lot of success in that area where there's been some serious disappointments in the past that take me longer than usual periods of time to recoup from, which about years at a time. So that was interesting that you pointed that out.
Yeah, it's a strong piece, and yet it's a totally sweet. It's a totally, and no, I'm not hitting on you. It's a totally sweet Venus. I mean, Venus is in Pisces there, but look at her. She doesn't have any. I imagine if we were to look at some higher degree, aspects that are not just the Ptolemaic aspects and the semi-squares and sesqui-squares, I imagine we would see more of Venus. But it's almost like as sweet as that Venus is, it's almost like she doesn't have a way to connect to all the other players sitting in the boardroom table.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going on without her. They all know she's there, because she's lovely. And yet she's kind of connected into her own fantasy dream world. And yet it's hard for her to find a way to express. Now, it will be interesting over the next several years as Neptune makes its once every 165-year conjunction with Venus. It'll be interesting to see how you can work that energy. And again, like I said with, with Rachel, we can worry about, Neptune coming up to Venus, it's going to be another, I'm going to fall in love, break my heart, I'm going to be misled. I mean, sure, you can run yourself into that belief system, and no doubt it'll happen. On the other hand, you can begin now, while you're still 3-4 years away from that Venus conjuncting, from that Neptune, transiting Neptune in the sky is at about 16 degrees of Pisces right now. And you can begin working that energy because Venus is already connected with Neptune in your chart. And you can begin to move to develop, how do I want to say this? To develop disciplines and practices that are incorporating of Venus, perhaps without having the all or nothing vulnerability or exposure that in the past has led to, kind of a difficult situation. I do think of Ram Dass, who calls relationships the yoga of the West, which I think is a very interesting concept. And Ram Dass basically, says, we have choices. We can close down from a relationship or relationships because when we go into them, our heart, I can't talk, because we can close down to prevent our heart from hurting, because if we go into relationships, there's no doubt. I mean, it's not a question. Your heart will hurt sooner or later. There will be pain, there will be hurt. But if one looks at it as a yoga, then one understands that part of being a human is the part of the yogic practice is learning to keep our hearts open in hell.
Absolutely. And be able to allow yourself to explain.
And I'm not I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm just saying that if you were my ongoing client and Neptune was coming up to Venus, I would certainly encourage you to explore ways to move into that rather than trying to avoid it, to find yourself overwhelmed by it, and then to find yourself having had another experience that was not, that left lingering pain.
Mm-hmm. One thing also, I like the aspect between the moon and Neptune, because I've been blessed with a lot of dreams, and I find my intuition kind of growing the older I get. With my meditations and my dreams, I've been blessed with finding that inner peace through the turmoil.
Yeah.
In a much more confident, trusting place. and things, I don't react to what's happening around me. I kind of learn to take a breath and, okay, let's see what happens. Something will work out. I have a lot of faith that everything is here and changing again. So it's all take a breath and go with the flow. And that's a great piece I've given myself.
I'm a fan of quincunxes, maybe because I have a natal one that's very, very close, like your moon Neptune. But, you know, quincunxes are, it's like if we can get over the idea that there's discomfort because we can't resolve them and we can't make them go away. With squares, at least you have something to chew on. You can turn a square into a daily practice and have real results. With quincunxes, it's just there's never a real resolution. And you know, I sometimes use the image of the mosquito in the tent, you know, and that when you're falling asleep, you begin to hear the mosquito buzzing, and then you kind of get, you know, then you stop, you know, and then it's like, where did it land? And then finally, you know, you hear it again and again, and finally you go, I got to kill that mosquito. I'm not going to be able to sleep all night, or I'm going to be bitten up all night. So you get out of your sleeping bag and you turn on your flashlight lanterns and you sit there and you wait for it, and then it doesn't appear. And finally you get back into your sleeping bag again, and just as you're drifting off, you hear that, you know, and so there's no resolution. But the good news is you get really good at getting in and out of your sleeping bag. And so with any quincunx, the practice is to try to figure out what it is that you're getting good at by the repetitive, frustrating behavior of not being able to resolve the differences, whether it's the meditation or the going into the space or the learning to detach or whatever it is, because it's not going to resolve the energies, but it is going to make them give you a byproduct, a side product of something that you can take with you.
Got it.
And yeah, I think for now that could be enough. Obviously, we didn't say, but just in passing, obviously the second Saturn return and, you know, the kind of now moving Saturn up toward your midheaven. You know, I would suggest, I would look at what was going on about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, when Saturn was down at the bottom of your chart, and what you began at that point in time, maybe going back to the 2000, 2001, 2000, when Saturn was in Taurus, you know, conjuncting your ascendant, and to give some thought to, now that you're through your Saturn return, what is it that's coming to fruition on a career path level? And, you know, what is it about your banking, mortgage banking? Incidentally, the Pluto trine Saturn is very much the dealing with those resources on a deeper level, you know, than, you know, not necessarily at the consumer end, but the, you know, the structures beneath the Pluto to the Saturn. But as Saturn and Pluto both come up toward your midheaven over the next calendar year through the beginning of 2020, what is it that you are going to consolidate, and how can you consolidate the gains that you've made so that as you move through this next phase, that you're actually beginning to climb down off that ladder? Food for thought.
Yeah, not to take too much time, but my gut feeling is that my industry is in for a major shakeup and change over the next year or so. I don't know if this avenue of employment is going to be available. I've got to find a way to switch gears to do what I want to do, which is work with people, whether it's through like counseling, what have you. I just kind of feel there's major change on the horizon. I just don't know exactly where the ground is going to present itself, or where the avenue is going to present itself, but that's kind of like what I'm feeling intuitively, that what I'm doing now is not what I'm going to be doing in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of waiting to see what unfolds. But thank you so much, Ray.
All right. Happy trails.
Thank you.
All right. Natalie, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can't see you yet.
You can hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, yes, I can hear you. And now there we have camera and Natalie, born October 28th, 1972. Hello. And where are you at geographically?
Hello, I can't see you. Let's see. I'm in Maryland.
Okay. All right. So, looking at your chart, I'm intrigued that if we take Chiron out of the picture, not that I would take Chiron out of the picture, but in doing certain stuff, I often, there's no end to how many planets we could look at. Chiron is not unique in as much as it's only the first named of now many, but about 8 or 10 centaurs that include Chariklo and Nemesis and Pholos. And I mean, Chiron is one of a bunch of stuff, just like Pluto is one of a bunch of stuff. And when I'm looking at chart patterns, I have the aspects right now turned on to Chiron. I normally would keep them turned off, even though I would look at where Chiron falls in a natal chart. But if we took Chiron out of the picture, we would have your entire chart falling almost within a hemisphere. I mean, if it was exactly within a hemisphere, that Jupiter would have to be, back about 15 degrees, to late Sagittarius. But there's no oppositions in your chart. I mean, the Saturn opposed Jupiter is not technically an opposition. It's a bit wide because it's out of sign and 14 degrees. But in a chart where there are so many planets clustered together in your chart, from Virgo through Capricorn, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 planets, clustered, within 90 degrees or just about 90 degrees. That to me shows a lot of focus. That's the good news. And yet it also sometimes is indicative of someone who has a difficult time seeing themselves as other people see them. It's hard to get. I sometimes refer to charts with no oppositions, and granted, you have the Chiron opposition, but I would take that out of the equation in talking about this. It's like if there are no visible planets in an opposition, it's hard to see yourself in the mirror. It's a vampire. Now, I don't mean the vampire that, sucks energy or blood out of others. It's just hard to get a sense of who you are without having a transiting planet move through the signs opposite, which obviously they do, or without being in a relationship with someone who has planets that are in Capricorn opposed your moon, or in Pisces, or in Aries, or in Taurus, or in Gemini opposed these planets down here. Because it's that other person then who becomes the opposition, becomes the reflector point. Now, obviously we have a chart of a Scorpio sun with a Cancer moon. This is water everywhere. And I don't want to say not a drop to drink, but there's not a lot that shows on the outside when you don't want it to show. There's a sense of the fiery Leo ascendant, and I'm less inclined to question a cuspal. This is a little bit wide to be cuspal, because this is probably about a good 15 minutes after Cancer rising, but the rising sign here is moving into Leo. So this is, rather than at the first couple we looked at that were 29 degrees moving out of the previous sign. So here I would say, okay, real Leo rising. I would, if you were a client, I would stop for a moment and speak about my little diatribe about how astrology historically has written by guys for guys, and that there's probably no sign in the zodiac where the gender behavior is so stereotypically different, that boy and girl Leos are not the same creatures, that boy Leos spend most of their life playing who's on top, trying to get superiority. The lion culture is such that the alpha lion doesn't get the alpha lioness. The alpha lion gets all the lionesses. And so there's a lot at stake. So the boys spend pretty much their whole life, kicking around on the football field and punching each other in the locker room and, talking about their conquests. And I'm over stereotyping here, but it's the guys that are typically on stage. Now, this does not mean that you can't have, a Leo energy in a woman, whether it be like a Madonna, or someone who actually can prance like a feminine cat. She has that Virgo, Leo mix actually. But the point here is that that the real lioness energy is much less about putting on the show. It's much less about the mane of hair that you might possess as a Leo rising, than it is about the intentions that you have to go to where you're going. You see, the female lions, the lionesses, just don't have time for the silly shit that the guys do, because they're basically giving birth to the cubs, raising them, doing the hunting, taking out the trash, balancing the books, figuring out what they need to do to survive, protecting the young, raising the family. They're doing work while the guys are playing football and drinking beer. Now, I'm over caricaturizing, but your Leo rising, especially with all that water behind it, your Leo rising has a purpose, and its purpose is so that you can hide your feelings, so that you don't have to appear vulnerable when you feel vulnerable, because the moon in Cancer is in your 12th house, and your Scorpio sun is in your 4th house. They're water, sun, and moon in water houses. The 12th house, a water house associated with Pisces. The 4th house, a water house associated with Cancer. And yet you have another couple of tools in your toolbox to cover your, it's going to sound all wrong, to cover your butt. But what I mean by that is that you have a Mars-Uranus conjunction trine Saturn. Let's hold off on its opposition to Chiron in just a moment. But that Mars-Uranus trine Saturn basically says, I can do the guy shit with the guys as well as the guys. I mean, it's like, I can be one of those guys in the locker room. And even though I might be a Scorpio, it's been said that Scorpio is ultimately a Mars-ruled sign, Scorpio and Aries, and that stereotypically that Aries women tend to deny their femininity, and they're the tomboys, where the Scorpio women play their femininity, and they're the ones that can be either, seductive or, play the feminine game, so to speak, to the hilt. However, in your chart, your Mars-Uranus conjunction in Libra, which is even though it's a Venus-ruled sign, it's a yang sign. There's an energy of equanimity, of balance there. And it being trine to Saturn gives you a stability and an ability to express yourselves in ways that are not necessarily tied to the hidden realms of the Scorpio and Cancer. One other thing, and that is that we have here an out of sign conjunction. I talked a little bit about that when I was looking at Lewis's chart. Your Venus is conjunct your Pluto. It's about a 5+ degree orb. And so I can't imagine, double negative here on purpose, I can't imagine that not working. That Venus Pluto, especially because you are a Libra Scorpio, I mean, you have Libra stuff and Scorpio stuff, that Venus, the planet of Libra, and Mars in Libra, and Pluto, the modern planet of Scorpio in Libra, Mars, the modern planet, the ancient planet of Scorpio in Libra, that your Venus Libra, even though they're in different signs, it's going to intensify and add depth, add passion, add power to your feelings, to your emotions. And I'm just noticing now that this I think in some ways reflects back to your natal Saturn and Gemini. How? In a weird way. And this is again going to that part of the chart that's weird, that's different, that's not the same as every other chart. These are the things that you could have your chart done by 200 astrologers, and I'm the one that'll notice the shit that's different because I've practiced over the years to pick out the things that are the most weird, the most different. And you have 2 conjunctions in your chart that are both about 5 or 6 degree orb conjunctions that both straddle 2 signs. So in other words, and that are both a personal planet with a transpersonal planet, and in fact, they're both in the same direction. Meaning that let's say you have the moon every month comes through Virgo, and then about 12 hours later, it's moved into Libra, and it lines up with your Pluto. In other words, every month, whether it's the moon or any planet, you'll get first the personal planet, Venus in Virgo, which is picky. It's careful. It's discriminating. I don't feel that Virgo is prissy like many of the textbooks say. I think it's just highly discerning. It has the ability to say no, and its boundaries are very non-negotiable. When there's a boundary, there's a boundary. And but Venus, a planet coming up to Venus, will then change signs and then conjunct transpersonal Pluto. By the same token, your Mercury and Neptune are the same degree spread, and they still straddle a sign. They're a conjunction in different signs. And by the same token, a transiting planet will first conjunct that Mercury, which says it the way it is or chooses not to say it for whatever reason, because sometimes Scorpio gains its power by what it doesn't say rather than by what it does say. And so that the planet will first line up with that highly perceptive and fixed, emotionally intense Mercury and Scorpio, and then it will change signs, become more dispersed in Sagittarius, and then the fantasy, then the dream, then it hits the Neptune. So that Mercury-Neptune conjunction and the Venus-Pluto conjunction have something in common that says something about you. Interestingly enough, even the Mars-Uranus, what it tells me is that in your life, things impact you personally, and then you shift them to the global. In other words, let's say each of these conjunctions were reversed, and you find a chart and you could check this out with a person, and those people will go through life and they'll have an experience that's a dream, that's a fantasy, that's something they read on the news, that's something's big, and then they internalize it and personalize it. You do it exactly the other way. Things for you begin personal and then become global or transpersonal or mythical. Does that make sense to you, Natalie?
Very much, yes.
And is that something that you've not really thought about in your chart just because it's like, who the hell ever talks about that crap?
Yeah, no, that's everything you've touched on is coming at it from a different angle than I've really ever considered it before. But that is very true. I mean, yeah.
And again, what I'm trying to do here is get us out of the habit of looking at a chart and going, you are a Leo, therefore you like drama and you like to show
Right.
everyone who you are, but your sun is in Scorpio, and so that you're a very intense and passionate being with your Mercury in Scorpio in the 4th house also, so you probably came from an environment where you couldn't express your emotions, and that's doubled down with the moon in Cancer, conjunct the South Node in a former lifetime. You know, you were basically maybe much more expressive, but now you have to hold in your feelings because maybe all that stuff is true. But it's not the only way to look at a chart. Are you with me here?
I am. It's nice to hear from a different
All right.
angle.
And I'm sorry, go ahead, say.
No, it's nice to hear it from a different angle. I appreciate that you are hitting the unusual points.
Let's come back to the Chiron opposition to the Mars-Uranus for a quick second, then say something about transits, and then we need to wrap up. All right. So, you know, Chiron is often dismissed as the wounded healer, and it may be the wounded healer, but Chiron is also the maverick. I like to remind us always when I talk about Chiron that when a planet is discovered, like Pluto was discovered at the time of the rise of mass fascism, each planet was discovered. Uranus was discovered at a time where individual rights, were overtaking the rights of royalty, etc., and so on. Chiron was discovered in 1977, the year that the Sex Pistols were happened. And no, I'm not just going here to sex because you're a Scorpio. In fact, I would say that the connection between sex and Scorpio is one of these absolutely over-made connections. The real connection should be made between intimacy and Scorpio, and intimacy and sexuality are not the same thing, especially in the Western culture. In fact, I would suggest that oftentimes that sex is used as a way to avoid intimacy rather than to pursue it. That's another discussion. But the fact of the matter is that Chiron was discovered at the time that there was great rebellion against the status quo. And it's not just simply political rebellion. Chiron is the maverick. It's the planet or the thing we discovered that broke the mold. It's like, wait a minute, a new planet was discovered. Oh, no, it's not a planet. No, it's an asteroid. Well, no, it's not an asteroid because it's not between Mars and Jupiter. It must be a comet. Yep, it's a comet. No, its orbit is pretty consistent. It's something else. And so it's a maverick, as are all the centaurs. And Chiron basically orbits between, it comes in closer than Saturn, which makes it physical. It makes it of this world because Saturn is the gatekeeper between the three-dimensional fallen realms. Lucifer, the fallen angel falls through the gates of Saturn and it becomes Satan. That's the three-dimensional world. Outside of the realms of Saturn, it's the divine proportion. It's the transpersonal world of metaphysics, of dreams, of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, if you will, transpersonal. Chiron cuts in closer than Saturn, but then it goes out further than Uranus. And so Chiron is the it's the first trans planet. That's what Chiron is. It doesn't fit either definition. And your Chiron, because it's in opposition to Mars Uranus, which is already rebellious. Look, you got that gene, that if everyone is saying left, there's a part of you that's thinking right just because you don't, there's a part of you that with Saturn in Gemini, trining that Mars-Uranus conjunction, I would imagine that you're someone who likes to read. I don't know that. Do you like to read? No, doesn't matter.
I do. I read a lot. Yep.
All right. So I imagine, though, that there's a part of you that that going back to student days, that you could have been reading an amazing book and it was assigned in class and you'd put it down because you don't want to read it now. You know, it's just that piece that has to rebel, that is a bit of a contrarian. And that contrarian is just to make sure that people don't assume that you're going to be the same as everyone else just because that's what you should do, because that's what good people do. I was going to say good girls, but this goes beyond that. This is what good people do. If you're good, you do that. So Chiron, in some way, I believe, because it's the planet that's in opposition, it's the piece of your puzzle that pays the price for not fitting in or for rebelling, and therefore sometimes losing the ability to feel soft, nurturing, to feel that, not that you're never there. I mean, look, you've got that Cancer moon. It's something that, I think you go there naturally and easily when you feel safe and when you feel protected, when that occurs. But the Chiron opposition is a bit tougher. And it's something that I think that enables you to go through life engaging with other people and being that person who is so firm and stable in who you are and what you do, that other people look to you and say, I want to be like you, or I want to, or it's like your advice matters. And for you, it's the flip side. You're basically in some way trying to get people you're trying to heal. This is Chiron, the wounded healer now. You're trying to heal your wounds and everyone else, not because they'll fix your wounds. Our wounds personally are unfixable. It's the human part of us that's human, no matter how much good acid, good sex, drugs, rock and roll, therapy, yoga, it doesn't matter. There's parts of us that maybe they won't hurt as much, but there were neuroses when we're teenagers, and they're the same neuroses, when we're 91 years old. They are there. But that Chiron opposition basically is the part of you that goes through life helping others, so that when you feel like you've helped someone else, then your pain is not as painful. It's the Fisher King, who is salving the pain in others, like Christ, fishing for souls and saving the souls, of others, as a way of basically salving or softening your own pain. So there we have it. However, we cannot end without talking about Uranus, because you've just gone through over the past 5 years or so, the Uranus not only going over your Chiron and stirring up all of those old wounds and pains, probably through an instant replay of a relationship of some sort, but that Uranus opposing itself and opposing Mars, and even going back to, maybe 6 years ago or so, as 7, 8, as it opposed Venus and even Pluto. I mean, this whole period of time. But now Uranus, as it's moved from Aries into Taurus, gone over your midheaven, it's messing with the opposition to your sun. And this is a bit of good news, bad news. The good news is that that there's probably no other time in your life where you can accomplish so much change in how you relate to other people, in adding juice and excitement and newness into your relationships. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's hard to know where you will be in a year or two, because the Uranus opposition your sun is creating, as part of all of this, a bit of that high frequency, high nervous energy, electric buzz. It's like putting your tongue in the electric socket and breathing as hard as you can to keep that energy moving through you, knowing that if you survive, it will have been an awesome experience. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be
Wow,
that bad,
Jesus.
but
I'm
there's
ready for that.
there's kind of an awareness here of going into a phase as that Uranus through 2010. I'm sorry, through 2019 and into 2020, as Uranus even touched into Taurus back last year, the middle of May, and then retrograded back, and it might feel like it's a little bit kind of chilled a little bit more now. But in March, April, May, as Uranus moves back into Taurus and begins to pick up on that opposition to your sun again, and the square to your ascendant, I think things once again will kind of the amplitude on the volume, on the electrical charge, the chi, the buzz will be turned up. And as long as you continue to move, as long as you continue to breathe deeply, going back to the, connecting to the electrical source, if you freeze up, if you hold your breath and freeze up, that's when the lightning strikes and can do, I don't want to say damage, but that's when, that's when shit goes down in a way you don't want to. However, if you can keep reminding yourself that this is safe, as long as you keep the energy moving, as long as you don't hold back in fear, as long as you don't go to that Scorpio place of going, I'm not gonna, because that's dangerous. And I'm not saying you should jump out of an airplane without a parachute just because Rick said engage in reality. No, that's dumb shit. Don't do that. But it's important that as you move through this period of time, that you willingly let go of things that you thought might have been important, because anything that you let go of will come back even stronger. It's the lightning striking and burning Yellowstone right to the ground. And 20 years later, Yellowstone has more plant animal life than it's ever had. Naturalists that thought Yellowstone was doomed forever is more vital than ever. And because this is an opposition, it might appear that this happens to people around you, but it's your energy. Don't just project it out there. Own your own craziness, strangeness, electricity, energy, kundalini, chi, whatever you want to call it, because the more you express it, the more you will take from this transition and have that freedom as you move onward. I mean, in some ways, you get to redefine yourself, and you've probably been doing that with gusto, because you've had to, over the past years anyhow, going back especially, to back when you were 41, 2, when, during the Uranus opposition, up through 2000, 14, 15, even 2016. But this is like a redux of that. This is like, it's not like a remedial course. It's like the PhD course. And this is where you get to write your thesis and do what you're going to do that you'll be able to live with for years to come. Also remember that Uranus, as it is as it is squaring your ascendant, and as it is opposing your sun, it's also trining your Jupiter. So this is certainly about an adventure, given the opportunity this next year, I would say yes, without trying to restrict what you think should happen, because what will happen is not necessarily what you think will happen or what you would want to happen, but it will all work out for the best, because that Uranus is trining Jupiter. Given an opportunity, go for it. Get your passport, get your whatever it is you need to do it. When Uranus knocks, open the door. I'm done. Your turn. Tell me something.
I will. Thank you. Oh, that's so much to think about, to assimilate. But Yeah, I will say in May, when Uranus sort of dipped its toe into Taurus, I think that happened. It was just about a week before the Chicago UAC conference, which is
Right.
something that had been on my radar for a while. I've been following you for a long time, and I had been interested in going to that. But whatever, I wasn't going to spend money on the plane ticket. And then that week that Uranus dipped its toe into Taurus, I had what I would describe as almost like an ecstatic experience in relation with that was related to a relationship, and just like this total epiphany and awakening that, yeah, I don't know. There's so much to say, but I am in the midst of reorienting the direction of, figuring out. I've had this very sort of deep internal experience thus far. I tend to be a voracious learner, and all of those skills, which have tended to be in the very Cancer realms of healing arts, food, nutrition, farming, that kind of stuff. But I'm ready to really take all of those internal skills and to figure out what to focus on so that I can see it as sort of an outward achievement. Whereas I've had this very internal experience thus far. I'm ready for it to sort of find my work out in the world that will take all these sort of skills
Gotcha.
and crystallize them in a way that I can give back. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, I'm in it right now. I feel similar to what Lewis said, I feel this massive change on the horizon.
Yeah,
I'm
and just remember,
hungry, kind of looking for change.
yeah, you don't need to
Tell
look
me.
you don't need to look for change right now. Change it's like going to the party and having the thing on your butt that says "kick me."
Okay.
It's like you got
Change
the
will find
antenna
me.
right now that is basically the change will happen. You don't have to go looking for it. It will find you. Thank
All
you.
right,
I
we'll
need to
bring
bring
it.
this to an end
Thank you.
because we have gone over our meeting time. And so thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Lewis and Rachel. And we have a list of others that we will kind of pursue next time. Two things between this time. Thank you. Between this class and next class, I'm going to write up a short list of things that I look for when I'm looking at a chart anew that may be useful for all of you. And I will post it in Patreon so that you can get it. I actually may even do it as with a supporting video, but I will do that because although we were able to go through these a number of charts today, what I'm trying to do here is to break you out of whatever the way is that you've done charts in the past that had to do with the kind of methodical sun, then moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then Mars, and just developing an eye to look at a chart and jump in with what seems to be important in the moment. Remember, more often than not, once we learn the notes of the scale, once we learn the planets, the signs, and the aspects, which you need to do, and I can't teach you that, that's like flashcards. That's like learning those things. And as you learn that, then it's a matter of how do you throw them together to make music. And the way we do that is by trusting our intuition as to leading us into the direction of what's important. So as we go here into tonight's lunar eclipse, remember, if it's dark where you are on the planet and there are no clouds, the lunar eclipse is available. It is total at about 9:15 Pacific time. That's 12:15 technically Monday morning Eastern time. Enjoy. It's a real rock and roll period of time. And we will see you all again next month. And thank you for your support. I am accessible via email. If you're one of the people whose charts I looked at and you want to get back to me with any information about, about your feedback on this and about anything that we may want to touch base on again next month, please do. Otherwise, I will see you all next month and have a happy full moon eclipse.